Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. For those of you who don't know, this is a special session of a class I teach here at the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School in Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So we were just downstairs with some of my students spending some time with Matthew here, and we were fortunate enough to have him come here, so we thought it would be important enough to open it up to let others from the Kennedy School and other people in Harvard, as well as people in the root cause community, to come here. So thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate that. Let me also just say a quick thank you to the Center for Public Leadership staff, as well as the team at Root Cause for putting this together. This is a unique time in Root Cause's history. We were recently fortunate enough to get a planning grant to grow our organization. And one of the key cornerstones of that planning we've been doing is to start to focus on strengthening our community. We've had a very fragmented community that's come together in disparate ways, and thought it was important to try to get more organized about that. And one of the ways to do that is to do two things we're doing tonight. One, bring speakers like Matthew Bishop to town to talk about important trends that we see that are critical to the way we think about philanthropy and innovation and investment. And two is to start to form more partnerships. Tonight's event is co-sponsored between the Center for Public Leadership and Root Cause, and that's a first for us as well, so we're very proud to be doing that. I don't believe that while the economy right now is struggling and limping along, that there could actually be, from my perspective, a better time for this conversation. I actually think that if we take a step back and we're smart about it, that the connection between innovation and investment from a social issues perspective is exactly the kind of conversations we should be having in a resource-strained environment. I would go so far as to say is that issues such as the environment, energy, workforce development, and education are the cornerstone issues that if we don't get a better handle on, we will not see the likes of the kind of wealth generation and growth in the economy that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years. And so with that, that there's possibly an opportunity here for the United States to take a leading role in social innovation and how we think about investment at the same time. So when I had the opportunity to meet Matthew, which was about a month ago at what was the first ever Social Capital Markets Conference, never before had there been that, and let alone what that term even means to many people, I immediately went up to him and introduced myself and asked him if he would come to Boston, and he graciously said, sure, I'm happy to come. And we are very fortunate to have him here, and I want to just briefly read a little bit about Matthew so you get an understanding of the breadth of his accomplishments as well as the notoriety of the book that he's come out with. Matthew is the American business editor and New York bureau chief for The Economist today. He's the author of several Economist special survey supplements, including recently The Business of Giving. Before joining The Economist, Matthew was on the faculty of London Business School, where he co-authored 3 books for Oxford University Press on subjects ranging from privatization and regulation to corporate mergers. And he has been honored by the Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum and is a graduate of Oxford University. Let me say, though, that those are all his accomplishments, but what was most amazing to me was when I started to look up a little bit more about the book, Philanthrocapitalism. Philanthrocapitalism, which is co-written with Michael Green, is on the global boom now underway in philanthropy. It's just been published by Bloomsbury. And if you go on his website, there were 3 things that I took notice of, which I think were pretty interesting and start to give you an idea of the level of notoriety it's getting. Number 1 is that there are 2 different pictures of Bill Clinton on the website. The first one is, instead of me, it's him going like this and holding the book up. And his global initiative. And the second is actually a video of Bill Clinton talking about the book and the importance of how as very many people as possible interested in philanthropy should read it. The second is catching Matthew on the Charlie Rose Show, for those of you who know that, amongst a round table of important people talking about philanthropy. But perhaps the third is some of the people that are quoted in the back about the book itself. The 2 most notably for me are Jim Collins, the great business writer who wrote Good to Great and Built to Last. And the second is Mayor Bloomberg, who I think has shown great pride in the way he's run the city of New York. Many might say he's even running it like a philanthrocapitalist, but in government of some sort overall. The book is about the examination of how today's philanthropists are revolutionizing the field, using new methods to a vastly greater impact in the world. So with that said, let's give a warm welcome to Matthew, and I'm going to sit down and we'll chat for a while. I also should have mentioned, by the way, that at the end of tonight, I don't know if everyone's gotten one, but we will be raffling off 10 of these books to people in the crowd, which is quite exciting. And can you hear me okay? Oh, let me turn this one off. I got it. Where is that? You got to turn it off? Okay. So Matthew, maybe we could start by you sharing with me. I mean, what is a philanthrocapitalist? Why is it different than a traditional philanthropist?
Philanthrocapitalism, we've got two definitions. There's a big definition and a micro definition. The big definition is that capitalism, throughout the history of capitalism, every time there's a period of extraordinary wealth creation driven by innovation, you see some of the most successful innovators who make the big fortunes start to invest in the social movements that address the big social challenges of the day. And when I started out on the book, I hadn't realized quite how that seems to be a repeating cycle throughout history. But you go right the way back to the Tudor period, as we do in the book, in Europe, where the first capitalist fortunes were made, and you start to see the successful business people of the day invest in things like new forms of education and healthcare and so forth. At the micro level, what's striking is that we've got instructions.
I think you want us to stand because we can see us. Okay.
So at the micro level, by a philanthrocapitalist, we really mean people who are being businesslike in their approach to giving. I think there are two sorts of giving in the jargon. One is sort of expressive giving, where you write a check to say something about yourself. So let's say you are a believer in a religion that says you must give 10% of your income away in order to be a virtuous person. So by putting your 10% away, you feel virtuous in some sense, regardless of what happens to the money and whether the money makes any difference to anybody. It's just the act of giving in itself being a good thing to do. The other sort of giving is instrumental giving, where you're giving to achieve a purpose. For me, the philanthrocapitalists are those who are saying, we're trying to make our money make a difference. We're more concerned with the results of the giving than the actual act of giving. And we're going to use our business brain to actually figure out how to make that money as effective as possible, rather than just having made our money with our business brain, switching our brain off and just letting our heart run away with ourselves and not actually make sure the money really does make a difference. So the philanthrocapitalists are those who use that business brain. And they're not necessarily a new phenomenon because, as I say, throughout history there have been periods where philanthropists have come out of the business world and have applied their business brain. I was contrasting, to some extent, the philanthrocapitalists with the established foundations, who we often think of as the main philanthropy, the Ford Foundations and Carnegie endowments and so forth, which have often become bureaucratic organisations. I'm not particularly singling those two out for criticism, but they're not driven by the entrepreneur that made the money in the first place, and they tend to be professional people who run them and naturally become much more sort of cautious and risk-averse in their behaviour.
So when you thought about writing the book, if I understand correctly, maybe tell us a little about the story of you with Gates and Buffett and how that transpired.
Yeah, and ultimately I've been thinking a lot about issues of wealth and how wealth changed people and how we created wealth and how the wealthy interacted with the rest of society for quite a while. And I had, during the dot-com boom in the late 90s, early part of this decade, had interviewed a lot of people who'd made money very quickly and discovered there was this concept called sudden wealth syndrome, whereby people suddenly felt completely disorientated by making lots of money and lost all sense of purpose in their lives. And all sorts of things.
Who wants that problem?
Yeah, it's terrible. And I'm sure there's therapy for it, but anyway, they found that giving was one form of therapy, actually, to dealing with their sudden wealth. But in the course of that, I interviewed Bill Gates for the first time, and I hadn't, until I'd interviewed him, really understood that the extent of his ambition. I mean, he really did feel there were 15 diseases that were killing many millions of people each year, that he personally had the ability to, through his philanthropy, end that suffering, end those diseases, and that it was something he was determined to do. And this sort of blew my mind a bit in terms of, I had never understood this to be that serious a force. I kind of thought of it more as a hobby for wealthy people rather than something fundamentally with the potential to transform how the world is in a big way. And then in 2006, I was lucky enough to be invited to the New York Public Library, where Warren Buffett came on stage and said, I'm going to give away most of my fortune. He wrote letters of $1 billion to each of his 3 children, and then another $1 billion to his wife's foundation, his late wife's foundation. And then finally he said the rest is going to go to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He called Bill Gates out onto the stage, and there you had the 2 richest men in the world standing on a platform saying, we're going to give away most of our money, and our plan is to make, to tackle some of the most intractable problems facing the world that governments have really not got to grips with, no one else has got to grips with. We're going to solve that problem. And I just thought this is a unique moment in history. I need to provide this is an opportunity to research it, to know the context of this, to understand why they're doing that, to see whether this is part of something more broad, reflecting more people than them thinking the same way. How does this relate to our traditional ways that we think about how society goes about solving huge problems, whether it be government or business or charity, traditional charity or whatever. And are they going to succeed ultimately? What do they have to do to succeed? And so with that incentive, I set off to research this book, and it amazed me how little the story has been told. I went, normally first thing you do is go and look at the literature, and there's very little that actually reports what's been going on. And so I came to understand that philanthropy has had a much bigger effect through the ages than I'd ever thought about in the emergence of the modern states and societies that we live in. And also that an awful lot is going on with some of those household names that I write about in the book, who I talk to, who really have very, very ambitious agendas about changing the world, and which are at the same time both extremely exciting, because you actually see they have the potential to achieve some of the things they're trying to do, but also challenging to me as a sort of democratic person at heart, who was nervous about the role of billionaires kind of coming in and taking on roles that I would have thought were more the role of the state.
Who would you say, so in the book you interviewed quite a number of very wealthy individuals from all over the world. Tell us a little bit about maybe one of the more interesting interviews, maybe one that's sort of puts philanthrocapitalism squarely as you see it, maybe perhaps another one that was maybe had some levity, but you're not sure if it
well, Gates, interviewing Bill Gates more recently about his philanthropy was very interesting, because over the intervening years since I first interviewed him, I talked to a lot of people in the global public health field. He'd obviously scaled up his giving on health enormously. And I talked to a lot of people who worked for the World Health Organization, for various government aid departments and so forth, all of whom had come to regard the Gates Foundation as some big kind of monster on the scene that was changing the policies, probably doing things that were against the conventional wisdom. So the general view in the public health field was, don't try and get rid of individual diseases, try and broadly improve healthcare systems in countries. And here was Gates coming on saying, I'm going to end all deaths by malaria by 2015. And they were horrified by this, frankly, and they said, well, who does he think he is? And this is a bad decision. And so talking to Gates was very, very interesting because, he's incredibly excited by his philanthropy, and it's a slightly mystifying interview because he rocks backwards and forwards as he gets more and more excited. And there was a tapping his pencil and sort of metronomic at the same time as well. Because you could really tell he was into this stuff in a big way. And but he says, the point he kept making was that we're incredibly small. It's a tiny little organisation. We're giving away $3.5 billion a year, which is the biggest ever foundation, but maybe a quarter of the annual New York public schools budget. And so, he left me with this extraordinary awareness that to really achieve impact, he had to leverage other people into his program. He had to get government money to support what he was trying to do. He had to get business money supporting his initiatives. He had to get the multilateral organizations behind him. So it was essentially, he became this kind of entrepreneur of public policy, and said he had to bring everyone else on board. And so he'd provide using his money in a really smart way. So how do I incentivize drug companies to use their R&D budget instead of, he used the example of baldness and erectile dysfunction. How do I get them to shift money away from those two and to put a bit more into saving millions of lives in the developing world? How do I get governments to use their aid budget in a more interesting way? So maybe to pre-commit to buy a whole load of drugs if they're produced, rather than just handing money over into a general government account and things of that kind. How do I get different non-profits to change their priorities? So he was all focused entirely on this sort of complex entrepreneurial activity, and it became clear to me, talking to other philanthropists, that this concept of leverage is absolutely crucial. That what they have to be really good at is taking a relatively small amount of money and changing the way whole systems work and problem solving. And actually you find lots and lots of examples of that happening.
You talked, maybe just to build off of Gates for a minute, because this morning you talked about the contradiction between the evolution of the social investing world, which is more watching where you invest your money in versus how you give your money. And maybe talk a little bit about that and where you think Gates now lies in terms of the Los Angeles Times, I think, piece.
Yeah, generally I'm a big fan of Gates because I think he really is. He really does see this as life's work from now on. He's 50 or 52, I think, and his father's still going strong at 86. So, I think he's 25, 30 years ahead of him of doing really active philanthropy, and he's clearly. A lot of integrity in what he's doing. I don't think it's not a fig leaf operation. It's not trying to improve his reputation. He really cares about it. But he got attacked in the LA Times early last year. It was a very clever piece of reporting by a journalist who now has a very good stage show where he shows photographs of the classic charity picture of the mother with the baby and the smokestack in the background, and what the picture, of course, is a mother with a baby who's being supported by the Gates Foundation, and a smokestack in the background that's owned by a company that the Gates Foundation's portfolio is invested in. And then the article really made this point that this seems like a terrible contradiction. Here's Gates on the one hand trying to be helpful, and on the other hand, he's causing, or in some sense, he's got a stake in the cause of the problem. And Gates was did very, very felt this was an extremely unfair criticism of him, and it says that basically he doesn't believe that he can change the behaviour of the companies that he invests in, and therefore he should just try and invest to maximise the wealth of his foundation, and then concentrate his energies on the things he can change, which are the projects that he gets involved in as a giver. But this is a very a lot of people feel he's now kind of moral. There's some kind of moral question there, and a number of other philanthropists are saying, well, we can't invest in companies that seem to go against the core of our mission, even if we don't believe we can change their behaviour, we just can't be associated with them. And so Jeff Skoll, who was the first chief executive of eBay, has made a number of movies as part of his Philanthrocapitalism, one of which was Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore's movie, and another was Super Size Me, about the problems of fast food. And in making that movie, he realised he had shares in Young Brands, and thought, well, this is kind of an impossible contradiction, so I've got to get that out of my portfolio. So that whole theme of kind of consistency between what you invest and how you invest and how you give is becoming more and more of a theme in philanthropy. And the other thing that I thought we had, I sort of pushed Gates on this one, and he said, well, look, one thing we don't invest in is cigarette companies. But he says if cigarette companies were suddenly to sort of stop making cigarettes and make candy, I wouldn't want any credit for that at all, because I don't believe it's my decision not to invest. So he's really kind of pure on this. I mean, it's an intellectual position that he just really doesn't believe the case. But my suspicion is that the public pressure will lead more and more to him changing his portfolio strategy for political reasons rather than because he actually believes it's the right thing to do.
Now, one of the ways that, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, that where the social investing side of this, which is more investing in public companies, and philanthrocapitalism, philanthropy is sort of beginning to gray, is some of the interviews you did about this increased interest in doing for-profit investing overall.
Yes, I was talking about Jeff Skoll, the eBay first chief executive. And the founder of eBay is a guy called Pierre Omidyar, who, and they both have pursued a strategy of saying, what we're really interested in is innovative solutions to social problems. And we're completely open about whether we get those solutions by giving money away or by investing in a for-profit company that achieves the effect better than a charitable approach. And so they've become both very strongly associated with social entrepreneurs and also very strongly associated with trying to develop for-profit solutions. So some of Skoll's movies are, I mean, for example, Charlie Wilson's War, for example, was produced by Skoll's for-profit filmmaking company. Another of his movies was made by a non-profit organisation. And Omidyar is investing, he's given away $100 million to Tufts University Endowment to invest in for-profit microfinance. Microfinance is the great example that both Skoll and Omidyar will point to. But here's something that started out as a charitable activity, funding, lending for small groups of mostly women in very poor countries to help them off the very bottom of the poverty ladder. And has over time, people have figured out we've got enough data to see how we can make a profitable business out of microfinance. And so there's now for-profit microfinance that is raising hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in capital and therefore reaching many more people with financial services than would have happened if we just stuck with a charitable model. And so some people like Omidyar and Skoll are looking at microfinance and saying, are there other areas where really basic services for the poor, such as clean water supply, basic healthcare, basic education, could also be, you could kind of use philanthropy to nurture the early development of business models. And then once the business model was proven, for-profit money could come in and grow this up to a much bigger scale so that many more people are helped. So that's the positive image. At the same time, those who were associated with the philanthropic era of microfinance, such as Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in this area, are increasingly hostile towards anything that involves making money out of the poor, which they see as sort of fundamentally exploitative. So you have this fascinating ethical and practical debate going on about, what are the ethics of using classic business methods to help to provide services to the poor, and what counts as predatory behaviour, exploitative behaviour, and what counts as just sort of a pragmatic, practical, best solution to scaling up very fast. And I think that's a real area to watch over the next few years, and these philanthropists are right in the firing line on that.
Well, that was a lot of what the conference we were at together was about, and it seems to me that the whole transparency issue, and we don't really know a lot about exactly what works and what doesn't. And I think you talk a lot about that in the book as well. I mean, do you think there are ways in which we can move in a direction where we can be more transparent with what's working and what's not? I mean, where are we on the evolution of transparency?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I mean, most of my career I've been a business journalist, so I'm writing about companies and financial markets and so forth. And I guess my instinct would be that if I moved from that sort of nasty commercial world to looking at the world of virtue, that it would be a much more transparent world where it would be much easier to find out what works and what doesn't, that people would be candid about their failures and constantly open and sort of struggling to evaluate honestly their progress or not towards their goals. And it turns out that none of that is true, and it's the most opaque world that you've ever seen, that no one is really candid about any failures, that there's almost zero data about anything, there's no rigorous analysis of anything, that you know, and you don't even have any sort of real measures of progress at all. So in the for-profit business world, if you don't make a profit, you know you're not making a profit, and you can only sustain that for so long before you go out of business. In philanthropy, you can tell yourself you're succeeding forever, really, until you run out of money, which could take you more than a lifetime. And so one of the things that I am arguing for, and some of the leading philanthropists, to their credit, like Gates again, are pushing for this, and Google and others are also beginning to help in this area, is for a much greater transparency, much greater reporting, much greater, a whole ecosystem of firms that are analysing what works and what doesn't work, so that we can actually know whether all this money, which is often taxpayer subsidised, is actually being put to good use. You know, is this money really achieving anything, or would it be better off if they were just putting the money into the government coffers and the government could spend it on whatever the government wanted to do? So we're calling for I'm calling for a much more transparent world. I'm also arguing that it's in the self-interest of the philanthropists to encourage this, because they can make this a tool to help themselves be more effective. And ultimately, you know, I think politicians are going to look more and more at these big piles of capital that philanthropists control, which have a tax advantage, and say, well, you know, what are we getting for our tax subsidy? And the more philanthropists are able to say, well, here's evidence of how we're making a difference, the harder it's going to be for that money to be touched by the politicians. And if they neglect that, on the other hand, I think it'll just be increasingly regulated as a sector.
So one I could sort of imagine if we move down this transparent role, the government could come in and be the ones to do that. Do you have any thoughts about that? Because clearly we have different government mechanisms in place right now to make the private sector more transparent.
Well, I think in general we're at a very interesting point because of the collapse in the financial markets over the past few months. I think the whole future shape of business and its relationship to government and government's role in general is up for grabs at the moment. I think we were in an era of 25 years, 30 years where market liberalisation, smaller government, the rhetoric of smaller government was in the role that private actors played in solving problems, was seen as a very good thing to be encouraged. And now we're in a period where the markets seem to have failed. The politicians and governments now feel, you know, they're not so smart after all, we may need people to fix the problem. And, you know, I think a lot of big decisions are going to be made over, you know, what's the tax policy going to be? Are we going to allow people to get very wealthy in the way that we did in the past? Or are we going to make it much harder for them to become wealthy? Do we try and spread the wealth around, to coin a phrase, through the tax system? Or do we actually try and create a more voluntary response where we try and say to the rich, you know, here is a way that you can be approved of in society by showing you're giving back. And if you do that, then, you know, you can expect to have a more favourable treatment from the government. I mean, so I think there needs to be a debate about what the unwritten but nonetheless real social contract between society as a whole and the wealthy, the wealth creators, should be. And I'm very worried that we go back to a big government approach that's a dumb big government approach, which is about shutting down wealth creation, about just paying money to the same old solutions that didn't work. Whereas there is an opportunity, even if we are going to go down the route of bigger government, for it to be smarter government that will tap into all this great innovation that's been going on through social entrepreneurs and philanthrocapitalists over the past few years, and to actually bring those people into the tent and help them really improve and transform parts of the public policy system that have been neglected or been stuck in this very uninnovative mindset.
And there is, if I'm not mistaken, some talk at the Obama administration about this, I think, in some way. We've done some work down in Louisiana, but what is some of that you're hearing? Are you hearing much about?
Well, I mean, there's part of the transition team is looking at social innovation, and many of the people involved in that team have come out of organisations that have been funded by philanthropy and that involve a lot of social entrepreneurs. A lot of that energy is going in around human capital issues, whether it be labour market development or education. For the one example of an organisation is one that actually is about taking legal immigrants, people who are here legally, that have skills, like doctors, for example, that have ended up finding themselves as taxi drivers, and saying, how do we help those people actually make use of their skills? That's clearly a win-win for them and for America, if we can actually get people who are trained doctors into the healthcare system rather than driving people badly and getting them into the hospitals. Essentially, that would be the happy outcome. So those sorts of issues are very big. I also think, if you look at this was a point that actually President Clinton made when I interviewed him. He was saying, look, when I became president, there was really no significant philanthropists concerned with foreign policy. There was the Ford Foundation that had obviously been around forever, but they weren't active in a big way in policy issues that he cared about. And he said, by the end of it, you're starting to see Gates had just started to increase his giving. If you look at the Bush administration, it's only popular foreign policy initiatives, which is not a long list, but what they are is they've all been driven by philanthropy. So if you take the PEPFAR initiative on AIDS, for example, that was very much the Gates Foundation working behind the scenes to encourage that. The Millennium Challenge Corporation, which has actually been popular with both parties as a way of disciplining the aid process so that aid is provided to governments that are actually showing some ability to implement good economic policy. That came out of Bono working with the Gates Foundation, working with Condi Rice, and then working behind the scenes with politicians on all sides. And so those initiatives have come out of philanthropy. And I think there's a big opportunity for Obama to sit down with some of the leading philanthropists who are focused on foreign policy to say, well, look, how do you guys think you can help our soft power strategy? America desperately needs to remake its image abroad. How do we work together in a more structured way to actually use the advantages that government can bring in tandem with the advantages that philanthropy brings? And so I think you'll see some progress there as well.
Do you think there's any lessons learned that Obama can take from Bloomberg? I know he's been extremely active in balancing this role of mayor and philanthrocapitalist in some ways.
Yeah, I think the Mike Bloomberg story, again, is not as well told as it might be. He's really used philanthropy in a very, very imaginative way. I mean, as you make the joke, I actually describe him getting elected as kind of the first philanthropic plutocrat, because essentially he spent $100 million of his own money to get elected. And I think he makes the case that he is, in some sense, freer as a politician to do the right thing, because he hasn't had to make promises to people for money to get elected. And because he is constrained by all sorts of conflict of interest rules that mean that he can't use that to increase his own wealth, but actually he is genuinely an independent figure. And I think his record in government, by and large, has suggested that he is a great sort of administrator who isn't being driven by, I'm sure there's some ego there, but he's not being fundamentally driven by corrupt purposes. He's being driven by service. And I think what's interesting is that he has a view that he's developed his time in office, which he's writing into a book at the moment, which is that government has a real problem with innovation, and it's to do with the combination of political coalitions that form around existing policies. So it's always much easier to see the losers when you change policy than it is to see the winners that will arise in future from policy changes. And the short-term horizon of politicians, so that you know you're going to have to get elected in 4 years, so you really don't want to have to spend 2 years fighting a very public row where lots of people say this person is taking away this thing that has benefited us. And so it creates this tremendous risk aversion in politics. So what he's done is adopted this policy of where there's an idea that he thinks is just going to get him into one of those fights because it's so controversial, he will instead get private philanthropy to pay for the first couple of years of the establishment of the policy, the piloting of it. And then if it's worked after 2 or 3 years, he can come to the political process and say, this isn't a new idea, this is an established, proven solution, we can see the value of it, let's put it into the budget now, and either scale it up or just make it part of the regular budget. And so philanthropy comes to play this role of being a kind of risk capital provider in social policy innovation, in government policy innovation. It plays this role of funding the high-risk phase of the innovation, the pilot stage, and then the government budget can take it over and scale it up. So just a couple of examples with Bloomberg. I mean, he's obviously used the charter school movement in a big way to drive higher educational performance in New York public schools, which have, I think, shown the biggest improvement of any major city school district in America over the Bloomberg period. But he also created, one of the reasons he was able to do this was he got philanthropists to fund a principals academy where new principals would get the equivalent of the training that a manager at General Electric would get at Crotonville, the Jack Welch Center at Crotonville, which is regarded in business as the ultimate business training for a new manager of a big division. And it's $150,000 a year per principal trained. And he said there's just no way that he could ever have sold that to the New York taxpayer as a good use of taxpayers' money. But in fact, it's very well proven to have worked. The principals that have come out of that academy are running are now really showing real impact in the schools that they're running. And so now that's being taken into the main budget of the New York schools. Another policy they're piloting is paying parents to have their children vaccinated and to turn up at school on time. This is sort of poor parents. Another initiative is to get people who are getting their earned income tax credit to open bank accounts by getting philanthropists to fund a matching amount. If they put the money into a bank, when they open a bank account, they'll double whatever up to about $250, whatever the first payment from the bank account is, which is sort of a great way of getting people out of the payday loan and other trap. It's a really interesting, imaginative use of philanthropy. And I think there's all sorts of ways that. I mean, it's interesting that Cory Booker, who I think is one of the great reforming mayors in one of the most difficult cities in America, he is using exactly this model. Going to Bloomberg for advice and doing it in Newark, where he now has an officer in charge of coordinating philanthropy in City Hall, getting philanthropists involved. And it's been interesting that some of the new generation of African American philanthropists have been very helpful, particularly in supporting some of his initiatives there.
I can't imagine Michael Bloomberg going to the city council and saying that he wants to pay parents. That probably wouldn't go over very well. So.
No, exactly.
You talk about in the book that each wave of wealth generation then follows with strong philanthropic giving, and that over time that philanthropic giving can get more and more strategic, and that now, because so much wealth has been created by so many, that there is a wave that's riding in philanthrocapitalism at this point. And I'm curious to know, as we sit though on a cusp of the economic challenges that we have, is what are the biggest hurdles that you see this wave facing right now? I mean, can it possibly die out, and that we'll have to wait until there is a major additional economic boom that who knows when that may come, or will this stick with us through this period of time? And what are the hurdles that you see that might have to get over?
I think we're clearly in a very, very difficult economic situation. And it's difficult not just because it's a recession and maybe quite a deep recession. It's difficult because the cause of the recession is, or the perceived cause is, a failure of the whole system. I mean, people feel like the whole financial system, which was supposed to be the brains of capitalism, has just had to be rescued by the governments of the world, which is the one thing that was unthinkable. And so there's a real crisis of confidence, and I don't think anyone in any government around the world has the answers to know how they can reform the system to make it less prone to this happening again. And so there's a real, those people who think they do know the answer are wrong. And so I think we're in that mode. And so in this environment, it's quite possible that very bad policy decisions will be taken, and that we shut down the wealth creation process. And in that situation, all bets are off about what happens to philanthropy. I think in the short run, many philanthropists will increase their giving, just as others decrease their giving because their fortunes have gone down. There's still a lot of wealthy people out there. There's still a lot of people who have the capacity to give. There are a lot of people who haven't yet given, who may see growing need as the motivation they needed to actually start giving. And I think in general, in this environment, those people who do have money to give are going to be even more concerned than ever about making sure they do give in a way that's effective and has real impact. And so they're going to be more interested in being philanthrocapitalistic in their giving than they might have been in the past. But I think we do face this situation where, for example, if you look back at the 1930s and the Great Depression, you went into a protectionist period which set back a very globalized economy into the opposite of that, very nationalistic economies. And if we do that now, we're going to kill one of the great sources of wealth creation over the last 25 years. And many of what I find is one of the interesting phenomena that I write about in the book is the emergence of philanthropy in every part of the world where there's been great wealth creation. It's not just an American phenomenon. I think it was often characterized during the late 20th century. This is a phenomenon that's part of capitalism, that as you get wealth creation, it seems to be that somehow some of those winners want to give back and reinvest in their society. That's because they see that their children and their grandchildren have a greater interest than anyone else in keeping that society healthy and effective. And so, African philanthropists were emerging, Indian philanthropists have been emerging. Even after the earthquake in China, we're seeing the first Chinese philanthrocapitalists starting to sort of be allowed to operate in China. And so there was this great momentum going. Now, if we go down the route of cutting globalization off, then that whole wealth creation process will affect developing world as well as the world we're living in. And likewise, really punitive tax rates will, even if it doesn't actually greatly increase the tax yield, will mean that wealthy increasingly feel they need to spend a lot more effort in moving their money to where they feel it's safe, and that's just not an environment that's conducive to imaginative, high-profile, transparent giving. And so you can really ruin this thing if the politicians go down that route. On the other hand, we make the right policy decisions. I think many of the underlying economic trends that caused this wealth creation, which were about information technology and globalization and all sorts of innovation in areas like biotech and just the general higher standards of education that meant that human capital in general was much greater. All those trends, we could continue with those. There's no reason why all those non-financial phenomena that were driving wealth creation can't continue, and we can't get back on track there. So it's a really one of those moments where decisions in the next year or so will define the next 25 to 30 years, I think. And they could go in a very wide range. And some of those will be very bad, and some of them could be pretty good. So, I think our leaders today have never had or rather the first time in a generation where there's been as much pressure on leaders where their decisions could have dramatically different consequences.
Is there a, I've gotten a dry throat here. So if philanthropy drives innovation, has anyone admitted any failures to you? What have been some failures?
Well, you know, they have admitted one or two failures. I mean, so most of the debate about philanthropic failures are at the level where it depends on your political ideology, whether you think it was a failure or a success or not. So, and then there are some really glaring examples in the early 20th century where some of the foundations backed eugenics experiments in Nazi Germany and things like that. But those are so catastrophic as failures that you kind of don't really learn a lot from that. But you know, for example, Jeff Skoll would say one of the examples he quoted was that he came across this really interesting initiative in India to create a kind of eBay for village produce of crafts and, you know, Indian arts and crafts. And so he gave, you know, 8 million or something to support the startup of that.
Ziba.
I don't know what it was called, but anyway, it was a complete disaster. Complete disaster. And he said, you know, because he didn't do the due diligence, he didn't actually say, well, how are you going to, you know, transfer these crafts to the people at the end? What's the payment system? All that kind of stuff that he did without even thinking at eBay, because that was the business. He didn't apply because he was trying to be kind and philanthropic in his giving side. So that was one classic example. The most famous example of all failures that everyone cites is the Annenberg Challenge, where Walter Annenberg, who, you know, this actually ironically came up in the third presidential debate in the context of the terrorist Ayers, and that you know, the reason Obama and Ayers met was they were sitting on the Annenberg Challenge committee, and Annenberg had put up $1 billion to try and fund school districts, reforms in school districts around America. And it turns out that every study that's been done of this says this was a complete waste of money, that it made $1 billion was given away to absolutely no demonstrable benefit to anybody. Because there was no strategy, there was no theory of change. How do you actually change education systems? What they just simply did was they found that every part, whoever seemed to have the best idea in the particular part of the country where the budget was being allocated to, just got the budget. And there was very little kind of conversation about why, and no comparisons really between projects. There was no sense that anyone really knew what overall was trying to be done. So that's a pretty big waste of money.
It's sort of an evolving. Skoll seems like he evolved. He made a few mistakes.
Skoll has done that, and I think what's interesting is that, you know, some of the more established charitable foundations are now getting more into the idea of admitting failure. So the Hewlett Foundation now has an annual contest internally amongst its staff, which a dinner is awarded for the person who made the worst charitable grant from which they learned something. So that's actually become a really fierce competition. It's a good dinner, I guess.
Let's open it up to the audience for the remaining time here. I think the mics are on for people, so why don't you, if you want, just raise your hand and I'll point you, or you can actually, if you want to just come up to the mics and start lining up, that might be the best way to do it. So we make sure that, come on up, maybe say your name and.
I'm Andrew.
Hi, nice to meet you.
There seem to be two models of philanthrocapitalism. One model, as demonstrated by, for example, in the UK, the Children's International Fund, which is a hedge fund that takes a big slug of its profits and then donates it to a foundation that it's associated with, a foundation run by a woman who graduated from the Kennedy School. Or Warren Buffett, for example, a person who was criticized for so long for having made so much money and compounding the return, compounding the interest, and then only toward the latter part of its life giving it away. So that's one model. On the other hand, you have the Skoll Foundation or Madrone, which is the Walton money, trying to invest in good and doing well at the same time. Maybe you would put the Kleiner-Perkins Green Fund in this model as well. The first model has shown that you can get top quartile returns, say 20 or 25% compounded annually. The second model, which is maybe newer, hasn't shown that it can be robust in a for-profit sense. And I was wondering, as we look to the future, if you think that the second model of trying to invest in for-profit businesses that contribute to the social good can in fact achieve top quartile returns, and if you think normatively one approach is better than the other.
I think it's too early to say with much confidence. What I think is happening is you're getting a lot of innovation and experimentation around trying to create hybrids of various kinds in business forms so that you're not committed to profit maximization. You can do maybe, sacrifice some profit in order to get more social benefit. Maybe you also you have triple bottom line measurements, all those kind of things. And I think there's a lot of ideas being tried out. I think there is no sort of theoretical right answer on this, because I think there are the problems with the real challenge is going to be, can you deal with the agency problem as an investor, that you are handing your money over to someone else, and you have to trust that they are going to be true about, when they make a trade-off between profit and the mission, that that's going to be an honest trade-off. And we've already seen in business, in for-profit business, where there is no additional complication about the social mission, that you get these massive problems where the managers pursue their own agendas and the shareholders, which the shareholders aren't happy about. And so you have this whole massive corporate governance debate. And the question is, do you get that problem squared in a situation where there's an additional excuse for management, which is, we're pursuing the mission, therefore we've taken lower profits. And it may be that there's something about mission-driven people that they are less inclined to those kind of selfish compromises, and therefore you might be able to get a better corporate governance structure for those new hybrid forms of business. But it seems to me that's an empirical question, and I think until we see it happen, we can't really tell up front. So I think there's more likelihood to be the old model of people make money and with one hand and then give it away with the other hand. I mean, that's a much more tried and tested model. But I'm very excited that people are actually trying these new models in the middle. And so I think it's a period where lots of things will be tried. It's not obvious that you need to have the shareholder market where every share can be sold as many times a day as you want to sell it to as many people as you like. That is just the best thing that's ever happened in capitalism. In fact, the rise of private equity over the past few years really highlighted a number of flaws in our public equity markets. So there is a need to figuring out better ownership structures, and clearly profit can be earned at the expense of social good. So hybrid other models that might actually allow you to find ways of curbing your profit instinct in order to help society are a good thing. So I think we're in a very exciting phase, and we'll watch it very carefully.
And this is, this is exactly the question that was asked at that conference we were at together. That this first ever social capital markets, and there are many, many innovations going on in this area. I think you actually led a discussion on stage amongst pure venture capitalists versus people actually trying this out, and the complexities of it not being proven. So the question really at that conference was, can you get lots of capital flowing in this way? And the answer was, I don't know, because there isn't enough evidence. It's too early on overall. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Greg. I'm not sure if this is on, but we've been focusing on sort of larger forms of charitable giving and foundations. I'm very much interested in kind of smaller scale distributed modes of charitable giving, but I wanted to get your perspective on what's in between there, and specifically kind of like the barriers and opportunities to forms of charitable giving like donor-advised funds, which are increasing in popularity, but specifically around international giving, so kind of the barriers to that.
I mean, the reason in the book we largely focus on the big names is, one, I think people are more, we're aiming to get a broader public and hoping that people would find names they'd heard of doing philanthropy interesting, and there's lots of colour and characters and so forth. But secondly, because they have this ability which Paul Shervish at Boston College calls hyper-agency, which is that they can mobilize resources and achieve things that are disproportionately greater than everybody else. So if you're Bill Gates, your capacity to ring up any person in the world and they will take your phone call, and any scientist, any expert will come and sit in your room, and just that convening power, and then you throw your money in behind that, the ability to drive change is phenomenal compared to anyone else. So we focused on them, but I think there are important lessons for everything else, which is, I think what they are looking for is increasingly evidence that they can have real impact with their money. And so they want to know where their money is going, how it's being used, they want feedback. And they also understand that they do feel committed to society to change. Now I think at lower levels of income, we're seeing more and more innovation, and I think we're on the threshold of a massive increase in innovation because of the kind of social networking, IT-based innovations that we started to see working in the Obama campaign, for example, where I think a lot of people will come out of that campaign. Those that don't go into government will say, well, what are the other causes that I care about? How do we apply what we've learned to trying to create much more capacity to organise, to share information, to get feedback? I'm very excited about Kiva.org, for example, which is this online microfinance site. I was talking to the founder of that the other day, who was saying, well, we're not just about microfinance now, we've become a kind of social network where people have discussions around aspects beyond the microfinance into all sorts of elements of giving. There's much more capacity going to be coming online for the beneficiaries to give feedback to the donors, which is going to be a real shift in the power balance in this whole world. And then at slightly higher levels of income, I think at the moment donor-advised funds are not particularly, it's not clear to me how much they're adding in terms of people's capacity to give effectively. They seem to be quite tax efficient, but I'm not sure whether yet the providers have started to use, to try and actually influence and help people be better givers. I'm much more excited by things like giving circles and organisations like Social Venture Partners, where people come together as a group. They probably put in, say, $5,000, $10,000 a year or something, and they will adopt a particular non-profit organisation, and as a group of them they will work together to mentor and to help that organisation grow. And I think there's some really good examples of that coming, and then there are probably similar things at slightly higher levels of income. But in general, I think this is an area where the days when people are just satisfied writing a $50 check to the Red Cross and that's the last they hear of it, that's just not something that is appealing anymore. And therefore the system is going to have to respond to the desire that people have for accountable giving rather than for participative giving. And so, and I think the technology is going to be there to allow them to do that as well. So I think that may be the big hot story of the next 5 to 10 years of how this whole thing goes mass market, and regardless of what happens to the macroeconomy and regardless of what happens to the billionaires, I think that trend is kind of unstoppable.
Thank you.
Good questions? Yeah, come on up.
Hey, I'm Sebastian from the MPA program at the Kennedy School. Basically, all the things you told us were very positive. Positive today. But you mentioned some small failures, and you gave us some hints at the problems of rich people finding their way into political office. But what about the negative effects on democracy? Like if no longer government solves social problems, but it's rich old white men that solves these problems, there might be no more need for taxation. And if there's no more taxation, there might be no more identification with the government. And you talked about punitive tax rates. So there might be some calls for, let's abolish taxes if Bill Gates and other people like him and his foundations can solve all our problems. But then there's nobody voting on the agenda of the Gates Foundation. So don't you see some tension rising here? Sorry.
It's not just old white men, it's beautiful Hollywood film stars as well. But it's not exclusively that. But I do think there is this there is a real political question. If this gets to the scale, and Gates already, I think, alone, the existence of Gates and probably George Soros and Michael Bloomberg, those three examples alone are already sufficient to make this a live political issue. It is challenging to the notions of democracy that we've all grown up with, and so that's why I argue there needs to be this social contract. At the moment, I don't believe that those particular philanthropists are a threat to any kind of political system I like at the moment. And so I'm not worried, but it could get to that phase if there isn't an attempt to ground it in a social contract, which I think is based around transparency and about going out of your way to build public consent for what you're doing. I think the fact that Gates understands that his $3.5 billion is small compared to the budgets of government or big business sort of shows that they are, to have an impact, they are forced to leverage others, and so the others don't have to be leveraged, and ultimately that's the constraint that Gates is under. If he can't persuade government to do what he feels is the right thing, then he can't persuade the government to do it, and he won't be able to do it. And so ultimately democracy, transparency, shining light on the process, is the best solution to this. And I think the philanthropists should take the lead in doing that, because it will create then the space to operate, rather than some scandal happening and the government cracking down on it with the philanthropists on the defensive. Where I'm more worried, and even more so having watched the latest James Bond movie, where the philanthropist, of course, is the villain, which is an interesting new Hollywood innovation in the script, is in developing countries where you are, where there is the potential, where you have bad government in place, to create quite dysfunctional partnerships. And so far there's not been a lot of evidence of corruption or anything, but you can imagine things getting a lot more complicated, and certainly operating in those environments is tricky for business, is tricky for everyone, I think. On civil society in general, though, I think one of the critiques that's been made of my work on this has been that philanthrocapitalists are inherently destructive to civil society, whereas I think, in fact, some of the best examples that I write about in the book are very positive about civil society. So, I think Jeff Stoll is playing a big role in promoting policy debate around climate change, and he's using his philanthropy to work carefully to build up the green movement, for example. I think the Pete Peterson Foundation, which has been established by the founder of Blackstone, has a mission to promote better fiscal policy in America, and a real debate around fiscal policy. And they bought this movie IOUSA, which is the inconvenient truth of fiscal policy, supposedly. And so they're promoting a debate, and I think that's very good. I think George Soros' record in Central and Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, where he's funded all sorts of civil society grassroots organizations as to build up a bastion against authoritarian power, has been extremely positive, even though it's made him Putin's #1 enemy. And I think also, say, a group like the Elders, which some of you may be aware of, which Richard Branson and others were behind the funding of and the creation of, where you've got these 12, Nelson Mandela and 11 people he's picked who are great world leaders, former world leaders, who go around the world acting as mentors to existing leaders. That's a tremendous initiative. You could never have got that through the United Nations system. It would have been vetoed by everybody you could imagine. And yet they're out there in Zimbabwe at the moment. You've got Jimmy Carter and Desmond Tutu trying to get into Zimbabwe and being repelled because the ELD is now an organisation that's got them there, and this is going to create much more, I think, a much more interesting civil society response to some of these questions of how do you deal with these leadership failures in some parts of the world. And again, the first African philanthropist, who again we write about in the book, is a guy called Mo Ibrahim, who made $1 billion selling a cell phone company that in itself was very liberating to many African people because it connected them for the first time to the information economy. He created a prize for the biggest ever charitable prize, which is for a retired African head of state who did a good job governing the country. And what this has done is promoted this tremendous debate in Africa about what constitutes good governance. And so already there have been 2 people who have won the prize. And people are starting to debate, well, should they have got the prize? And other heads of state now in the job, even though they could get many times more of that money by just sort of taking some of the money out of the treasury and sticking it in Switzerland, which just used to be the way. They're now saying, well, actually, I'd rather be seen of as a good leader rather than... So there's already, and this is not just a debate at the highest political levels, it's become a public debate because there's a lot of coverage of that. So I think there's a huge opportunity for a huge positive role that philanthrocapitalists can play in promoting a more effective civil society, as well as, in some ways, which is a much more positive analysis than just saying they're rich, therefore, in some sense, they're bad.
Did you want to ask one last question?
No, I kind of answered it myself.
What was it?
No, I mean, I was curious about, and your last question was a little bit...
Maybe just stand up and...
Oh, sorry.
Thanks, that's okay.
My question, and you sort of answered it at the tail end of your last question, is in these conversations with the various individuals or high wealth net worth individuals, to what extent was the dialogue focused around areas where you talk about measurable impact, and obviously Mr. Gates is very much into looking at meaningful statistics, to basically like failed nations like Burma and North Korea. And you kind of touched upon it with Jimmy Carter's time in Zimbabwe, but I mean, some of these places you can't really. It's very difficult to find measured impact in the short term. I was curious to what dialogue you heard about.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the mischaracterizations of philanthrocapitalism has been that it's all about measurement. I think it's about impact, and some impact is actually very hard to measure progress towards. And so, a number of philanthropists, people have started their philanthropic career, and they've kind of come up with this barrage of metrics, and actually they've realized after a while that it actually, what you can measure is often not what you're trying to achieve. And there's this real mismatch between the ease of measurement and the ease of and the effectiveness of your strategy. And so, I suppose the greatest example of that is the Betty and Gordon Moore Foundation by the founder of Intel, which is kind of has this legendary in its obsession with metrics, and has finally, I think, this summer decided that it needs to ease up on that, because otherwise it's never going to achieve the kind of impact it wants to achieve. I think that then takes you into a whole set of questions about qualitative measurements rather than using data, and which I think is a less robust system. But it doesn't. But I mean, all sorts of things. We're used to, in politics or in business, all sorts of decisions are taken on a qualitative basis rather than a quantitative basis. So, if you get the kind of transparency and disclosure that I'd like to see in philanthropy, there's no reason why you can't reach a balanced judgment on whether someone's really made good use of the money or not. That isn't based on, did they every quarter or every 6 months distribute this number of needles to this place or spend this amount here. So I think we're going to move into a more qualitative debate on some of these areas. And Gates has been very interesting. Again, I mean, I think very early on he was focusing on measuring vaccinations and so forth, and now he realizes that his real big challenge is to actually change drug delivery systems so that when you invent the drug and get it out to parts of Africa, that not only does the drug get delivered to the person that needs it in a form that is usable, but that actually they have the behavioural patterns established whereby they're going to take the drug in the right way. And so those sorts of things are just, there's no measurement system that's going to help you in that respect. But there are probably data that you can get that will give you some indications of how you're doing, but it's not, you know, and certainly when you come to the elders, I mean, that's going to be a much more ad hoc judgment as to whether that's worked or not.
Let me end with one last question, and then we'll have Alison come up and raffle off these books. But so there are a lot of students in the audience. Many of them are in my class, and many of them have ideas that they'd like to get off the ground. And I think there's been a number of them that asked in class and outside of class, well, how do I access the Philanthrocapitalists? You know, how do I get the money that I need to get my idea off the ground? And so take us inside the head of these people who I assume are representing a wide group of people. And what advice do you have for them, for budding social innovators and entrepreneurs out there to get their ideas and bring them out?
Well, no, I do think thinking of the idea in a business-like way is important. So that is, you know, being able to write a business plan for what you're doing in terms of these are our goals, this is our strategy, these are the risks, this is what we hope to achieve by when. Because that at least gives you the basis to then have a conversation with someone that has the money to fund the idea in a language that they will understand. I mean, typically someone like Gates is going to want someone with a reasonable track record before he's funding them. So, you know, there are all sorts of angel-type networks that organisations locally to wherever you are will have used to get off the ground. And there is increasingly an infrastructure which is, you know, where one level of funder takes a social enterprise from, you know, the lowest level up to a certain level, and then a new level of funder will come in and take it from the next level to an even higher level of scale or whatever. And so those networks are beginning to be much more widespread. So in New York, the one I know in particular is Echoing Green, which is you know, a very, very, very high percentage of the the pretty small scale of social enterprises that it backs, you know, succeed. It has a fantastic track record, and so, you know, and then the social enterprises that they cultivate tend to get picked up by bigger donors. So there's very much as in business. I mean, if you were thinking about venture capital and starting a business, you would have exactly the same set of questions. Now, I think probably more work needs to be done in terms of just mapping online. You know, I don't think there is a database where you could just go online and say, I'm in Boston, here's the 3 organisations I would go to. If I had, and that's I think shows that we're still some way from getting this whole industry, the business of giving, up to a level of maturity where it's really achieving what it could do. But you know, I would say that I do think this is all moving in the right direction. I think in 5 years' time, you know, notwithstanding my worst fears about the economy, I still think we're going to be in a world where people with great ideas are going to find it easier to get funding and easier to be given the backing to grow innovative social solutions than I think we've got today. And we're certainly much better today than we were 5 or 10 years ago. So I really do encourage you all to, you know, to pursue your ideas, but to do it in a, you know, in a serious way, and expect that you'll be treated seriously if you do that. Lastly, I have a website which I would also encourage you to take a look at, where we do try and blog on some of these issues. And if you think there's a subject we should be looking at, email me. My email is just matthewbishop@economist.com.
And the website?
The website is philanthrocapitalism.net. At the moment, the comment facility is turned off at the moment because we're trying to figure out how to stop being spammed in a big way. But we will have that on before long. But it usually gets a fresh post every day. So thank you so much for coming out and
take a leading role in social innovation and how we think about investment at the same time. So when I had the opportunity to meet Matthew, which was about a month ago at what was the first ever social capital markets conference, never before had there been that, and let alone what that term even means to many people. I immediately went up to him and introduced myself and asked him if he would come to Boston, and he graciously said, sure, I'm happy to come. And we are very fortunate to have him here, and I want to just briefly read a little bit about Matthew so you get an understanding of the breadth of his accomplishments as well as the notoriety of the book that he's come out with. Matthew is the American business editor and New York bureau chief for The Economist today. He's the author of several Economist special survey supplements, including recently The Business of Giving. Before joining The Economist, Matthew was on the faculty of London Business School, where he co-authored 3 books for Oxford University Press on subjects ranging from privatization and regulation to corporate mergers. And he has been honored by the Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum and is a graduate of Oxford University. Let me say, though, that those are all his accomplishments, but what was most amazing to me was when I started to look up a little bit more about the book, Philanthrocapitalism. Philanthrocapitalism, which is co-written with Michael Green, is on the global boom now underway in philanthropy. It's just been published by Bloomsbury. And if you go on his website, there were 3 things that I took notice of, which I think were pretty interesting and start to give you an idea of the level of notoriety it's getting. Number 1 is that there are 2 different pictures of Bill Clinton on the website. The first one is, instead of me, it's him going like this and holding the book up at his global initiative. And the second is actually a video of Bill Clinton talking about the book and the importance of how as very many people as possible interested in philanthropy should read it. The second is catching Matthew on the Charlie Rose Show, for those of you who know that, amongst a round table of important people talking about philanthropy. But perhaps the third is some of the people that are quoted in the back about the book itself. The 2 most notably for me are Jim Collins, the great business writer who wrote Good to Great and Built to Last. And the second is Mayor Bloomberg, who I think has shown great pride in the way he's run the city of New York. Many might say he's even running it like a philanthrocapitalist, but in government of some sort overall. The book is about the examination of how today's philanthropists are revolutionizing the field, using new methods to a vastly greater impact in the world. So with that said, let's give a warm welcome to Matthew, and I'm going to sit down and we'll chat for a while. I also should have mentioned, by the way, that at the end of tonight, I don't know if everyone's gotten one, but we will be raffling off 10 of these books to people in the crowd, which is quite exciting. And can you hear me okay? Oh, let me turn this one off. I got it. Where is that? You got to turn it off? Okay. So Matthew, maybe we could start by you sharing with me. I mean, what is a philanthrocapitalist? Why is it different than a traditional philanthropist?
Philanthrocapitalism, we've got 2 definitions. There's a big definition and a micro definition. The big definition is that in capitalism, throughout the history of capitalism, every time there's a period of extraordinary wealth creation driven by innovation, you see some of the most successful innovators who make the big fortunes start to invest in the social movements that address the big social challenges of the day. And when I started out on the book, I hadn't realized quite how that seems to be a repeating cycle throughout history. But you go right the way back to the Tudor period, as we do in the book, in Europe, where the first capitalist fortunes were made. And you start to see the successful business people of the day invest in things like...
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming. For those of you who don't know, this is a special session of a class I teach here at the Center for Public Leadership at the Kennedy School in social innovation and entrepreneurship. So we were just downstairs with some of my students spending some time with Matthew here, and we were fortunate enough to have him come here, so we thought it would be important enough to open it up to let others from the Kennedy School and other people in Harvard, as well as people in the root cause community, to come here. So thanks so much for coming. Really appreciate that. Let me also just say a quick thank you to the Center for Public Leadership staff, as well as the team at Root Cause for putting this together. This is a unique time in Root Cause's history. We were recently fortunate enough to get a planning grant to grow our organization. And one of the key cornerstones of that planning we've been doing is to start to focus on strengthening our community. We've had a very fragmented community that's come together in disparate ways, and thought it was important to try to get more organized about that. And one of the ways to do that is to do two things we're doing tonight. One, bring speakers like Matthew Bishop to town to talk about important trends that we see that are critical to the way we think about philanthropy and innovation and investment. And two is to start to form more partnerships. Tonight's event is co-sponsored between the Center for Public Leadership and Root Cause, and that's a first for us as well, so we're very proud to be doing that. I don't believe that while the economy right now is struggling and limping along, that there could actually be, from my perspective, a better time for this conversation. I actually think that if we take a step back and we're smart about it, that the connection between innovation and investment from a social issues perspective is exactly the kind of conversations we should be having in a resource-strained environment. I would go so far as to say is that issues such as the environment, energy, workforce development, and education are the cornerstone issues that if we don't get a better handle on, we will not see the likes of the kind of wealth generation and growth in the economy that we've seen in the last 10 to 20 years. And so with that, that there's possibly an opportunity here for the United States.
The entrepreneur that made the money in the first place, and they tend to be professional people who run them, and naturally become much more sort of cautious and risk averse in their behavior.
So when you thought about writing the book, if I understand correctly, maybe tell us a little about the story of you with Gates and Buffett and how that transpired.
Yeah, and I got, ultimately, I've been thinking a lot about issues of wealth and, you know, how wealth changed people and how we created wealth and how the wealthy interacted with the rest of society for quite a while. And I had, during the dot-com boom in the late 90s, early part of this decade, had interviewed a lot of people who'd made money very quickly and discovered there was this concept called sudden wealth syndrome, whereby people suddenly felt completely disorientated by making lots of money and lost all sense of purpose in their lives. And
who wants that problem?
Yeah, it's terrible. And I'm sure there's therapy for it, but anyway, it's, they found that giving was one form of therapy, actually, to dealing with their with their sudden wealth. But in the course of that, I interviewed Bill Gates for the first time, and I hadn't, until I'd interviewed him, really understood that the extent of his ambition. I mean, he really did feel there were 15 diseases that were killing many millions of people each year, that he personally had the ability to, through his philanthropy, you know, end that suffering, end those diseases, and that it was something he was determined to do. And this sort of blew my mind a bit in terms of, you know, I had never understood this to be that serious a force. I kind of thought of it more as a hobby for wealthy people rather than something fundamentally with the potential to transform how the world is in a big way. And then in 2006, I was lucky enough to be invited to the New York Public Library, where Warren Buffett came on stage and said, you know, I'm going to give away most of my fortune. He wrote letters of $1 billion to each of his 3 children, and then another $1 billion to his wife's foundation, his late wife's foundation. And then finally he said the rest is going to go to build new forms of education and healthcare and so forth. At the micro level, what's striking is that have we got instructions?
I think we want to. You want us to stand because no one can see us. Okay.
So at the micro level, by a philanthrocapitalist, we really mean people who are being businesslike in their approach to giving. I think there are two sorts of giving in the jargon. One is sort of expressive giving, where you write a check to say something about yourself. So let's say you are a believer in a religion that says you must give 10% of your income away in order to be a virtuous person. So by putting your 10% away, you feel virtuous in some sense, regardless of what happens to the money and whether the money makes any difference to anybody. It's just the act of giving in itself being a good thing to do. The other sort of giving is instrumental giving, where you're giving to achieve a purpose. For me, the philanthrocapitalists are those who are saying, we're trying to make our money make a difference. We're more concerned with the results of the giving than the actual act of giving. And we're going to use our business brain to actually figure out how to make that money as effective as possible, rather than just having made our money with our business brain, switching our brain off and just letting our heart run away with ourselves and not actually make sure the money really does make a difference. So the philanthrocapitalists are those who use that business brain. And they're not necessarily a new phenomenon, because, as I say, throughout history there have been periods where philanthropists have come out of the business world and have applied their business brain. I was contrasting, to some extent, the philanthrocapitalists with the established foundations, who we often think of as the main philanthropy, the Ford Foundations and Carnegie endowments and so forth, which have often become bureaucratic organisations. I'm not particularly singling those two out for criticism, but they're not driven by